Welcome back to the circle, friends, as the logs settle and the orange embers pulse like a beating heart. Tonight, as the wind whistles through the trees, we turn our minds to a time when the coming of winter was a life or death struggle. In our modern world, we turn a dial and the heat rises, but for our ancestors, survival was a craft learned over 1,000 years of shivering. But before we step into the snow-choked forests of the Middle Ages, please take a moment to subscribe to Campfire Night Stories. A simple like on this video helps our fire stay lit against the cold and ensures these stories reach those who seek the wisdom of the past. Tonight, we aren't just talking about blankets and wood, we are talking about the architecture of survival. How did families live through months of sub-zero temperatures in houses made of mud and straw? Tonight, we uncover how medieval people survived winter without modern tools. The year was 1315, and the first frost had arrived with a sudden, crystalline violence that turned the world to iron overnight. Young Thomas stood outside his small wattle and daub cottage, watching his breath bloom in the air like a white ghost. He looked at the grey sky, knowing that the long dark was coming, a time when the sun would be a rare and distant friend. Thomas was a man of the fields, but his strength meant little against the invisible teeth of the northern frost. He turned as old Alaric, the village elder, approached him, leaning on a staff of gnarled oak that looked as ancient as the hills. "The ice is deep in the stone already, Thomas," Alaric said, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like dead leaves. "If you want your children to see the spring, you must stop thinking like a man of summer and start thinking like a bear in its den." Alaric had seen 70 winters, a miracle in an age when the cold claimed the old and the very young with a casual cruelty. He led Thomas back toward the cottage, pointing at the walls that Thomas had spent the autumn patching with fresh mud and straw. "The warmth is a liquid, boy," Alaric whispered, "and your house is a leaky bucket that must be plugged." The medieval cottage was not built for views or light, it was built as a thermal fortress designed to trap every scrap of heat. The windows were tiny, mere slits in the thick walls, and they were covered not with glass, but with translucent animal bladders or oiled parchment. These windows let in a dim yellowish light, but they kept out the biting wind that could extinguish a candle in an instant. Inside, the floor was covered in a thick layer of strewing herbs, dried rushes and straw that acted as a primitive carpet of insulation. But the heart of the survival strategy was not just the walls, but the living occupants themselves. In the Middle Ages, the concept of a private bedroom was a luxury that only the dead could afford in their graves. For the living, survival meant the communal hearth, where the entire family, and often their livestock, huddled together in a single room. Alaric pointed to the far corner of the cottage, where Thomas's 2 cows were tethered to a heavy wooden post. "The breath of the beast is the gift of the Saviour," Alaric said, watching the animal's warm steam rise into the rafters. A cow or a horse produced as much heat as a small furnace, and by keeping them inside, the family could raise the temperature of the room by several degrees. The smell of manure and animal sweat was a small price to pay for the literal life-giving warmth they provided. Thomas watched as his wife, Elena, began to bank the central fire, using a heavy iron couvre-feu, a fire cover, to trap the embers for the night. The fire was never allowed to truly go out. It was the sacred flame that kept the darkness at the door. Tonight, we follow Thomas and Alaric through the frozen months, exploring the food, the clothing, and the ancient rituals of the winter men. Part 2. The art of the perpetual flame. To a medieval villager, the fire was not just a tool, it was the primary member of the household that had to be fed and tended. Alaric sat Thomas down by the central hearth, which was nothing more than a ring of blackened stones in the middle of the dirt floor. There was no chimney in the modern sense. The smoke drifted upward, filtering through the thick thatch of the roof. While this made the air thick and stinging to the eyes, it served a vital purpose in the survival of the house. The smoke acted as a preservative, coating the rafters and the hanging meats in a layer of soot that prevented rot and deterred vermin. More importantly, the smoke-clogged thatch was an incredible insulator, trapping a pocket of warm air just below the roofline. "The smoke is the blanket of the house, Thomas," Alaric explained, gesturing to the dark, hazy ceiling. "If you see the stars through your roof, you will be a corpse by matins. The smoke must stay, even if it bites your lungs." Gathering wood for this perpetual flame was the primary labour of the autumn, a desperate race against the first snowfall. A family would need tons of seasoned hardwood oak, ash and hawthorn to see them through until the April thaw. But wood was often a regulated resource, and the right of estovers allowed peasants to gather only what they could take by hook or crook. This meant they could use a hook to pull down dead branches or a shepherd's crook to snag wood, but they could not cut down standing trees. Thomas had spent weeks in the forest, his hands cracked and bleeding, dragging bundles of windfall back to his woodpile. He also gathered turf-thick blocks of peat cut from the bog, which burned with a slow, smouldering heat that lasted all night. Alaric showed him how to layer the fire, placing the heavy peat at the bottom and the dry wood on top to create a steady, reliable warmth. "The fire must breathe, but it must not roar," Alaric cautioned. "A roaring fire is a hungry thief that steals your wood too fast." They also used fire dogs, iron grates that lifted the logs off the floor to allow air to circulate, a simple piece of engineering that changed the efficiency of the hearth. But even with a steady fire, the corners of the room remained frozen, and the water in the wash basin would often turn to solid ice by morning. To combat this, the family relied on local heat, small, portable sources of warmth that they could carry with them. Thomas's wife used a foot stove, a small wooden box with a perforated metal lid that held a single glowing coal. She would place it under her skirts while she sat and spun wool, the heat rising to create a personal microclimate. At night, they used bed wagons, large wooden frames that held a pot of hot coals slid between the heavy woolen blankets to preheat the bedding. These tools were the modern technology of the 1300s, the difference between a night of shivering and a night of restorative sleep. Alaric watched as Thomas practiced banking the fire, his movements slow and deliberate. "Respect the spark, Thomas," the old man whispered, "for in the winter the spark is the only thing that stands between us and the grey wolf of the frost." Part 3. The Calorie War. In the heart of winter, the body is a furnace that requires constant fuel, and for Thomas and his family, hunger was the cold's most loyal ally. Alaric sat at the heavy oak table, watching Elena stir a thick grey pottage in a soot-blackened iron pot. "In the summer, we eat to live, Thomas," Alaric said, his eyes fixed on the bubbling stew. "But in the winter, we eat to burn. If the belly goes cold, the limbs will soon follow into the grave." The medieval winter diet was a masterclass in high-calorie preservation, focused on fats, and complex carbohydrates that took a long time to digest. The centerpiece of their survival was pottage, a thick stew made of dried peas, beans, and grains like barley or rye. It was kept on the edge of the hearth for days, with new ingredients added as others were eaten, a perpetual stew that never truly grew cold. But the secret weapon against the frost was lard, the rendered fat of the pigs they had slaughtered in late autumn. Elena would stir a massive spoonful of white fat into every bowl, ensuring that every bite was dense with energy. Fat was the most precious substance in the village, more valuable than gold during the months of the long dark. It provided the long-burning energy the body needed to maintain its core temperature while working in the snow-choked forest. They also relied on hard cheese, which was packed with protein and could be stored for months without spoiling in the cold corners of the cottage. For Thomas, the midday meal out in the fields or the woods was a brick of dense, dark rye bread and a piece of salt pork. This salt pork was so heavily preserved that it had to be soaked in water for hours before it was even edible, but it carried the salt the body needed to retain moisture in the dry winter air. Drink was equally important, but they did not drink cold water from the well, which could shock the system and lower the body's temperature. Instead, they drank small ale, a low-alcohol beer that was served warm and provided a steady stream of liquid calories. Even the children drank it, for the fermentation process made the water safe and the grains provided extra nourishment. A man who drinks only water in the frost is a man who invites the ice into his veins, Alaric cautioned. They also gathered winter berries and dried sloes, which provided a sharp hit of vitamin C to keep the scurvy rot from loosening their teeth. But the ultimate luxury was honey, the only sweetener they knew, which provided a quick burst of glucose for a body struggling to stay awake. Thomas watched his children eat, their faces smeared with fat and broth, and felt a momentary relief. The larder was full for now, but the calorie war was a marathon, not a sprint, and the hardest months of February and March were still a shadow on the horizon. Part 4. The woolen armour. If the pottage was the fuel, then the clothing was the insulation that kept the heat from escaping into the hungry night. Thomas stood as Elena wrapped a long strip of coarse, boiled wool around his legs. These were winnegus, or leg wraps. In the Middle Ages, the secret to staying warm was not one thick garment, but a dozen thin, layered ones. First came the linen undershirt, which wickered moisture away from the skin, for a damp skin in the winter was a death sentence. Over this went a tunica of heavy wool, and then another, until Thomas looked twice his actual size. "Wool is the breath of the sheep, Thomas," Alaric said, feeling the thickness of the fabric. "Even when it is soaking wet from the snow, it will still hold the heat of your skin. It is the only fabric the North respects." The wool was often unwashed, meaning it still contained the natural lanolin oils from the sheep. This made the clothing smell strongly of the farm, but it also made it nearly waterproof, causing the melting snow to bead up and roll off the shoulders. But the most vital piece of winter technology was the hood. The medieval hood was a gargantuan piece of engineering, covering not just the head, but the shoulders and the chest as well. It was often lined with the fur of rabbits or squirrels, the poor man's fur, which trapped a pocket of warm air around the face. "Lose the heat of your head, and you lose the blood of your feet," Alaric noted, pulling his own hood tight. On their feet, they wore shoes of thick cowhide. but they were stuffed with dry straw and moss to create a barrier against the frozen ground. Thomas also wore mufflers, large fingerless woolen mittens that allowed him to work with his tools while keeping his palms warm. There was no such thing as fashion in the 14th century winter. There was only the strategic layering of fibre. Women wore even more layers, their long skirts acting as a mobile tent that trapped a massive amount of body heat. When the family sat together by the fire, they looked like a heap of colourful wool, their individual shapes lost in the bulk of their protection. Ilaric showed Thomas how to grease his leather boots with a mixture of beeswax and tallow to keep the slush from soaking through. A wet foot in January is the start of a journey to the churchyard, the old man said grimly. Every piece of clothing was a result of a year's labour, the shearing, the spinning, the weaving, and the sewing. Survival was a full-time job that began in the spring and ended only when the first primrose appeared in the woods. Part 5. The Architecture of Fellowship. But the cold was not just a physical enemy, it was a psychological one that bred isolation and despair. To combat the winter gloom, the medieval village relied on a radical form of communal living. During the worst weeks of the wolf month, January, the village would often gather in the largest house or the local tithe barn. They would bring their fires together, pooling their wood and their food to create a single, massive centre of warmth. The cold loves a lonely man, Thomas, Ilaric said as they prepared to walk to the village gathering. But it fears the sound of 100 voices and the heat of 100 bodies. This was the time of storytelling, the oral tradition that kept the culture alive during the months when no work could be done in the fields. Old Elaric was the master of these nights, spinning tales of ancient kings and forest spirits that made the children forget the frost outside. They played games of tables and nine men's morris, their minds active even as their bodies were confined. This social insulation was just as important as the wool on their backs. It prevented the sickness of the spirit, the deep depression that comes from living in a dim, smoky room for months on end. They also practiced huddling, a literal survival technique where the entire family would sleep in a single great bed, or box bed. These beds were built into the walls and had wooden shutters that could be closed from the inside. By sleeping 4 or 5 to a bed, their collective body heat kept the temperature inside the box bed nearly 20 degrees warmer than the rest of the room. It was a primitive but highly effective form of shared heating that ensured the youngest children didn't freeze in the middle of the night. Thomas felt the warmth of his daughter sleeping against his arm and realized that survival was not an individual act. It was a delicate web of animal heat, wooden boxes, and the steady, reassuring breath of his kin. Outside, the wind screamed against the thatch, searching for a gap, but the house of Thomas was a sealed vessel of life. I understand. We are currently at approximately 14,800 characters in the total narrative. We are now pushing into the deep winter, focusing on the specialized medicines used to fight the frost and the intense psychological strain of the hunger moon. This section will add roughly 12,000 to 13,000 characters, moving us closer to the 28,000 mark as we head toward our 40k goal. Part 6. The Medicine of the Frost. As the midwinter moon rose, casting a pale, deathly light over the snow-buried village, the physical toll of the cold began to manifest in more than just shivering. Old Ilaric sat by the hearth, watching Thomas rub his hands, which were cracked and weeping with chilblains. In the 14th century, the medicine of winter was a desperate battle against the withering of the flesh. "The frost does not just bite the skin, Thomas," Alaric said, pulling a small earthenware jar from the shadows. "It drinks the moisture from your blood and leaves your skin as brittle as an old parchment." The jar contained unguentum, a thick, foul-smelling salve made of rendered mutton fat, beeswax, and crushed marsh mallow root. This was the medieval version of a protective barrier cream, designed to seal the cracks in the skin before the green rot of infection could take hold. They also suffered from pernio, the painful swelling of the toes and fingers caused by the sudden transition from freezing cold to the heat of the hearth. Alaric warned Thomas never to put his frozen feet directly toward the flames. "You must coax the heat back into the bone with snow water first," the old man cautioned. "If you rush the fire, the blood will burst the veins, and you will lose the toe to the black death of the frost." This was a primitive understanding of what we now call frostbite and the dangers of rapid rewarming. For the sea cough, or the heavy chest that came from breathing the constant smoke of the cottage, they used a syrup of honey and dried coltsfoot herb. They believed the cold was a physical weight that settled in the lungs, and only the heat of spicy herbs like mustard or horseradish could break it apart. Elena would make a mustard plaster, a hot, stinging cloth applied to the chest to draw the cold out through the skin. The pain of the mustard was seen as a sign that the medicine was working, a fiery counterattack against the icy grip of the winter lung. But the most feared winter ailment was the sleeping sickness, not the tropical disease, but the profound lethargy caused by the lack of sunlight. Today we call it seasonal affective disorder, but to Alaric it was the thieving of the spirit. "When the sun forgets us, the mind begins to wander into the grey forest," Alaric whispered. To fight this, they used Street John's wort soaked in ale, believing the yellow flower carried a piece of the summer sun within its petals. They also used the medicine of light, burning their precious tallow candles during the darkest hours of the evening to trick the mind into feeling the day was longer. Survival was a clinical process of managing the body's chemistry with whatever the forest and the larder provided. Thomas watched his children drink a bitter tonic of boiled willow bark, which we now know contains the precursors to aspirin. It numbed the aches of the joints that came from sleeping on the cold ground and eased the headaches of the smoke-filled room. Every herb was a tiny green soldier in a war that lasted for 5 months. Part 7. The Hunger Moon and the Thinning Rations. By the time February arrived, the Hunger Moon, the initial confidence of the autumn, had begun to fade into a grim calculation of resources. The woodpile that once looked like a mountain was now a small hill, and the salt pork in the rafters was hanging thin. Thomas watched as Elena carefully measured the grain for the morning pottage, her movements slow and deliberate. "The belly is a clock that is ticking toward the spring, Thomas," Alaric said, his eyes scanning the nearly empty shelves. "And February is the hour when the clock often runs out of weights." This was the time of the thinning, when the family had to reduce their caloric intake to ensure the seed grain for the spring planting was not eaten. To eat the seed grain was to survive the winter but commit suicide in the autumn. To stretch the flour, Elena began to mix it with ground acorn meal or even finely chopped straw and dried sawdust. This hunger bread was bitter and hard to digest, but it provided the bulk the stomach needed to stop the cramping of empty hunger. They also looked to the winter harvest of the forest, the inner bark of certain trees and the hard nuts that the squirrels had missed. Thomas would spend hours chipping through the ice of the frozen stream to catch a single sluggish trout. The fish was small and bony, but its oils were a godsend for a family whose fat stores were nearly depleted. In the medieval winter, the hierarchy of the meal changed. The working man ate first, for if Thomas could not swing the axe, the fire would die. The children ate second, and the elders, like Alaric, often took the smallest portion, viewing their own survival as secondary to the future of the bloodline. "I have seen enough springs," Alaric would say, pushing his bowl toward the youngest boy. "The sap is low in my branches. Save the broth for the new shoots." This was the brutal, sacrificial psychology of the medieval winter, a collective understanding of survival that modern individualism has forgotten. They also relied on winter ale, which was brewed stronger and thicker to provide a sense of fullness when the pottage was thin. The alcohol provided a temporary warmth and a much-needed blur to the harsh reality of their situation. But as the wind howled outside, Thomas could hear the wolves drawing closer to the village walls. The predators of the forest were also feeling the hunger moon, and they knew that a village weakened by cold was a village of easy prey. Thomas sharpened his spear by the light of the embers, his stomach growling in rhythm with the wind. He was no longer just a farmer, he was a guardian of a dying flame, waiting for the first sign of the sun's return. Part 8. The Sun, Return, and the Breaking of the Ice. The first sign of the end was not the heat, but the change in the light. One afternoon, as Thomas was hauling a final load of peat, he noticed that the shadows on the snow were longer and the sky was a different shade of blue. "The sun has found its legs again, Thomas," Elaric shouted from the doorway, his face lit by a rare, genuine smile. This was the time of Imbolc, or Candlemas, the midpoint between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. It was a psychological turning point, a signal to the village that the grey wolf was beginning to retreat. They celebrated by cleaning the hearth and lighting every candle they had left, a ritual of calling back the heat. But the breaking of the ice was also a time of great danger, the time of the great melt. As the snow on the thatch began to melt, the water would seep into the walls, threatening to collapse the mud and straw structures. The streams would swell into raging torrents of ice chunks and mud, often flooding the low-lying cottages. Thomas and the other men worked frantically to dig channels in the frozen earth to lead the water away from their homes. "The water is the last trick of the winter," Alaric warned. "It tries to drown what it could not freeze." But with the water came the first spring greens, the bitter dandelions and nettles that pushed through the slush. These were the first fresh foods they had tasted in 5 months, and they were eaten with a religious fervour. They were blood purifiers, packed with the vitamins that finally ended the lethargy of the long dark. The family emerged from the cottage looking pale, thin, and smelling strongly of smoke and animal musk. But they were alive. Thomas looked at his children, who were running in the muddy slush, and felt a profound sense of victory. They had survived without a single modern tool, using only the wisdom of their ancestors and the heat of their own shared lives. Alaric stood beside him, leaning on his staff, looking at the first buds on the hawthorn tree. "We have paid the price of the winter, Thomas," the old man said softly. "Now we must pay the price of the spring, the labour of the plough, and the sweat of the sun." The perpetual fire in the hearth was allowed to burn down to a small, manageable spark, no longer the roaring god of the winter. The cycle had completed itself, and the village of 1,315 had held its ground against the dark. I understand perfectly. We are currently at approximately 23,000 characters, adjusting for the slight variance. I will now provide the first of the two final outputs. This section will focus on the winter of the mind, the psychological and spiritual endurance required to survive the isolation, and the specific rituals used to keep the community from fracturing. This part will add approximately 8,500 characters, bringing our total to roughly 31,500. Part 9. The Winter of the Mind. Beyond the physical hunger and the biting frost, there was a deeper, more silent enemy that haunted the medieval cottage. The winter of the mind was the heavy, crushing weight of living in a world that had gone dark and silent for months on end. Old Elaric often watched the younger men of the village, seeing their eyes grow hollow and their tempers grow short as the weeks dragged on. "The walls of the house do not just keep the cold out, Thomas," Elaric said, sharpening a small bone needle by the dying light. "They also trap the spirit in a cage of smoke. If you do not find a window for your soul, it will begin to bite at your own heart." In the Middle Ages, the lack of stimulation and the constant proximity of family members in a tiny space created a unique psychological pressure. To combat this cabin fever, the villagers relied on the work of the fingers tasks that required focus and repetitive motion is less than Hasson. 0 hash is greater than. While the fields were frozen, the interior of the cottage became a bustling workshop of survival and art. Elena and the other women spent every waking hour spinning wool, the rhythmic whir of the spindle acting as a form of communal meditation. Thomas and the boys carved spoons, repaired leather harnesses, and wove baskets from willow branches gathered before the freeze. These tasks were not just about utility, they were a psychological anchor, a way to prove to themselves that they were still masters of their environment. If the hands are idle, the mind will start to weave its own shadows, Elaric cautioned. They also used the game of riddles, a tradition where the family would challenge each other to solve complex, poetic puzzles about the natural world. It was a way to keep the intellect sharp when the body was confined, a mental exercise that turned the smoke-filled room into a theatre of the imagination. "What has a neck but no head, and wears a cap but has no hair?" Elaric would ask the children, his eyes twinkling. The answer was a bottle of ale, but the process of guessing brought laughter and a temporary release from the fear of the storm outside. But there were nights when even the riddles failed, and the night hags of anxiety would sit on the chests of the sleepers. They believed that the melancholy was a physical vapour that pooled in the corners of the room where the air was stagnant. To clear this spiritual fog, they would burn bundles of dried mugwort and juniper, the sharp, cleansing scent acting as a psychological reset. They also practiced vigilance, the shared duty of watching the fire throughout the night. Thomas found that the hours he spent alone with the embers were the most profound of his life. He was the guardian of his family's warmth, a role that gave his suffering a sacred purpose and a sense of heroic duty. This sense of vocation was the ultimate medieval therapy. You did not survive for yourself, but for the lineage that lived within you. Part 10. The Sacred Geometry of the Hearth. As February reached its peak, the great silence of the snow began to play tricks on the ears of the villagers. They would hear voices in the wind or the rhythmic thump of a giant's footsteps in the shifting ice of the river. Elaric showed Thomas how to create a sacred circle around the hearth using white ash and salt. The frost is a chaotic spirit, Thomas. It hates the straight line and the perfect circle. This was the popular psychology of the age, the use of ritual and geometry to create a sense of safety in a world that felt increasingly alien. They believed that as long as the circle was unbroken and the fire stayed within its stone ring, the wild hunt of the winter spirits could not enter the home. This gave the family a physical boundary for their courage, a small territory of light that they could defend with absolute certainty. They also used the counting of the days, marking the passage of the winter on a wooden clog almanac, a notched stick that showed the feasts and the moons. Seeing the notches grow toward the spring was a visual medicine, a proof that the darkness was finite and that the sun was a traveller who was slowly walking home. Elaric would have Thomas carve a new notch every morning at dawn, even if the sun was hidden behind a wall of grey clouds. "Do not wait to see the light to believe in it," the old man said. "You must carve the hope before the heat arrives." They also shared dream lore, where the dreams of the night were analysed for signs of the coming thaw. If someone dreamed of a green bird or a running stream, the whole family would celebrate as if it were a physical reality. This collective optimism was a survival trait, a way to maintain the will to live when the body was at its lowest ebb. They were not just surviving a season, they were participating in a cosmic drama of death and rebirth. Every morning that they woke up and saw the frost on the inside of the door was a victory over the void. Thomas realized that the cold had stripped away everything that was unnecessary, leaving only the core of what it meant to be human: fire, food, and the people he loved. The medieval winter was a forge that hammered the spirit into a harder, more resilient shape. As the first ice bells began to ring the sound of the ice cracking on the trees as the temperature shifted, Elaric stood up and stretched his stiff limbs. "The mind has held the fort, Thomas," the old man said, looking at the notches on the wood. "Now the body must prepare for the final climb." Part 11. The Law of the Last Log. The most dangerous time of the winter was not the beginning, but the very end, when the resources were nearly gone and the spirit was most fragile. This was governed by the Law of the Last Log, a communal understanding that no house should let its fire go cold while a neighbour had wood to spare. If Thomas ran out of fuel, he would not be left to freeze. The village would redistribute the remaining windfall to ensure everyone reached the spring together. This social insurance was the reason the medieval village survived for 1,000 years without a single government agency. They understood that a dead neighbour was a hole in the defence of the whole community. Thomas watched as Elaric carried a single heavy log of oak to the widow's cottage at the end of the lane. "We are like the sheep in a storm, Thomas. We huddle together or we die alone." This sense of mutual obligation was a psychological warmth that was more powerful than any fire. It removed the fear of the ending, for you knew that your survival was the concern of every soul in the valley. They also practiced the Feast of the Scraps, where everyone would bring the very last of their lard and grain to the tithe barn for a final desperate celebration. It was a way to laugh in the face of the hunger moon, a middle finger to the frost that tried to starve them. They danced until they were breathless, their heavy woolen clothes trapping the heat of their movements until the room was as warm as a summer day. This burst of physical activity and joy was a biological spark that reignited the metabolism and the morale of the people. Tomas felt the blood rushing to his face, the first time he had been truly warm in months. He realized that the nonsense of the village dances and the silly games were actually the most sophisticated tools in their arsenal. They were the things that kept the heart beating when the pottage was gone. As they walked back to their cottage, the air was still freezing, but the winter of the mind had been broken. The long dark was no longer a monster. It was just a season that was finally running out of time. I understand perfectly. We are standing at approximately 31,800 characters. We are now entering the final stretch of our journey, through the frost, the re-entry into the world of the sun, the lessons we can learn from their bone-chilling endurance, and our final farewell by the fire. This final section will add the remaining 8,200 to 9,000 characters, bringing us to the 40,000 character target. Part 12. The Thaw and the Scent of the Earth. The end of the winter did not come with a fanfare of trumpets, but with a quiet, persistent dripping from the eaves of the cottage. Young Tomas woke to a sound he had forgotten during the months of the long dark, the sound of liquid water seeking the path of least resistance. Old Alaric was already at the door, pushing back the heavy woolen curtain and inhaling deeply of the damp, freezing air. "Do you smell that, Tomas?" the old man asked, a look of profound relief softening the deep lines of his face. "That is the scent of the mud waking up. The earth is beginning to breathe again." In the Middle Ages, the thaw was a period of both liberation and extreme logistical challenge. The roads, which had been frozen solid and easy to travel, turned into rivers of knee-deep muck that could swallow a horse and cart. The village became a messy, chaotic island, isolated not by the ice, but by the very moisture that promised life. But for Tomas, the mud was a miracle. It meant the internal furnace of his family could finally slow down. He watched as Elena opened the small stone window for the first time in months, allowing the smoky, stale air of the cottage to be swept away by the fresh spring breeze. They began the spring clean, a ritual that was as much about hygiene as it was about the spirit. Every piece of straw and rush on the floor, which had absorbed the grime and spills of 100 winter nights, was swept out and burned in a massive communal bonfire. The winter nest was destroyed to make room for the new life of the season. Ilaric showed Tomas how to whitewash the interior walls with lime, which acted as a natural disinfectant to kill the winter rot that had settled in the damp corners. "The sun has returned to the sky, so we must return the sun to our walls," Alaric said, watching the white paint brighten the dim room. They were survivors of a war that had no soldiers, a war fought against the very air itself. Tomas looked at his children, who were pale and thin, but possessed an energy that seemed to mirror the sprouting seeds in the garden. They had been forged in the darkness, and they were ready for the light. Part 13. The Lessons of the Frozen Hearth. As we look back at the world of 1,315 from our comfortable chairs, we might see their lives as a tragedy of struggle. But to Tomas and Alaric, survival was a triumph of the human intellect and the communal spirit. They managed to live through sub-zero temperatures with nothing more than fat, wool, and the breath of their cattle. They taught us that the human body is more resilient than we give it credit for, provided it is supported by a community that refuses to let its fire go out. Their tools were not made of steel or plastic, but of habits, traditions, and an intimate knowledge of the natural world. They understood the thermal mass of a mud wall and the insulating power of a smoke-filled roof. They knew that the greatest source of heat in the world is not the fire in the hearth, but the person sitting next to you. The made-up nonsense of their winter spirits was just a way for them to respect the power of a season that could kill them in an afternoon. In our modern world, where we are isolated by our own individual thermostats, we have lost the ritual of the huddle. We have forgotten the psychological strength that comes from sharing a single room, a single pot of stew, and a single goal of survival. Old Elleric's Gospel of the Hearth is a reminder that we are at our best when the world is at its worst. As the village began to prepare the ploughs for the first furrows of the spring, the winter of 1315 became a memory, a story to be told by the fires of the next year. Thomas realized that he was now a winter man, a man who knew the true value of a dry log and a warm bed. He had earned his place in the long line of ancestors who had held the north against the ice. Part 14. The Final Descent. The fire here at our own campfire has now burned down to a pile of white ash and a few glowing coals. The wind has died down, and the night is still, as if the forest itself is listening to the echoes of the past. We have travelled through the smoke-filled cottages and the frozen forests of a world that was both harder and simpler than our own. We have seen how our ancestors used the magic of fats and the geometry of circles to keep the darkness at bay. Tonight, as you return to your warm home and your modern comforts, take a moment to look at your own hearth. Think of the men like Thomas and the elders like Eleric who stood where you stand thousands of winters ago. Remember that the warmth you feel is a gift, a legacy of 1,000 years of struggle and survival. May your fire never go cold, and may your community be as strong as the wattle and daub walls of the past. Thank you for joining me for this journey into the heart of the medieval winter here at Campfire Night Stories. If these tales of ancient resilience have touched your soul, please remember to like this video and subscribe to our gathering. Your support is the wood for our fire, allowing us to keep these stories burning for the generations to come. Sleep well, and may your dreams be as warm as a midwinter huddle and as bright as the first primrose of spring. The embers are fading. The earth is waking. The night is yours.